is the evidence tied or related to the argument? And then is the evidence explicit? Meaning, is it the evidence that needs the least amount of schema?
Mm-hmm.
Don't have to make an inference. Those are our key points.
So we look back into this question. What confused students? So what did they pick as a distractor?
Yeah, so we had identified like the 2 potential distractors in the assessment cover page, and one of them they picked more than the other. So 18% of kids picked what we call distractor 1. So we thought about this all summer. And so going back to our assessment cover page, we said what that meant was they didn't understand this key point around the explicitness of the evidence, and them needing the least amount of schema and not having to make an inference. So they got confused by, it's almost like they naturally made an inference that threw them, rather than stopping and asking themselves, like, should I be making this inference, or which piece of evidence doesn't require me to make an inference.
Yep, great. So if you want to actually just take this key point, because I think that's our point of entry for where we're going to reteach is the key point that they based off the answer. And what percentage of students fell into this distractor trap?
18%.
Okay, let's note that right next to it. And then the other 9%.
Were that first sentence.
Okay.
And they were tripped up, looking back at the assessment cover page.
Right here.
By,
the
imaginative language, like not knowing that they needed examples of character actions.
Too literal.
Yeah.
Rather than just the language. So we think about, now is the reflection, this is the content reflection, so we know content-wise, these are the 2 key points we have to go after. Now I want us to step back and think about what actions instructionally, in terms of how we taught it in execution, do you think were at the heart of that? And let's get down to the teacher action. So we're going to take the kids out of it, put us back in it. What do we think, how it was taught?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I definitely told them, like, you need to make sure the evidence you're choosing is the most explicit. That means, like, do you need schema for this? You know, if not, then that's stronger evidence. But I didn't really give them the opportunity to, like, look at each other's answers and evaluate them, or like look at actual evidence, and like we didn't have an explicit discussion about it other than me giving them reminders.
So what did it look like?
Well, I guess so I hit on it most in the we do, like, but you know how like I was reviewing my key points before I released them to answer questions. And so when I did that, I would like state this key point because I was hitting on all the key points and then release them. And I guess when I said my key points in the I do too, I said this key point, but I don't think that I really modeled it explicitly in the I do, and then when I brought them back in the we do,
you didn't model
asking myself whether this evidence is explicit or not.
And by asking that, you would have asked yourself, am I using
schema? Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't model that. And then in the we do, when I brought them back, so I like, again, you know, I said those key points, release them. When I brought them back, I think like mostly what I would do is, again, I would just tell them, I would be like, oh, like you forgot to use this key point. That's not the most explicit evidence. Like you added your schema, and then I would just like correct them. But I didn't give them the chance to actually explain
or evaluate.
Yeah. Right, or evaluate.
So as a result of not being able to evaluate, they then couldn't explain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And,
Because I was the one doing the
and specific,
evaluation. I was
yes.
telling them, like, you didn't do this.
And what
you
were
didn't
they,
do
and
this.
they weren't able to evaluate based on,
The amount of schema that they were
Yes.
using.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so after you write that, we can,
Didn't give them the opportunity to evaluate how much schema they were using. I told them that they were using too much, etc. But they didn't do that evaluation themselves.
and then didn't have a chance to explain why.
Mm-hmm.
So let's step back for a second, and I want us to, in the next bullet here, write out what this would look like. Or maybe explain to me, so if you don't want to write out, if you want to first explain, like, what would this kind of back and forth, or dialogue inside discussions in the classroom would look like?
So I would keep the part where, okay, next question, like, here are the key points, write it, think about it, turn and talk, and then bring them back together. And then I would say, okay, look at your answer that you chose.
Yeah.
And I would just state this key point and ask them to consider it. So, like, look at the answer that you chose. Ask yourself, is this evidence explicit? Did you have to use schema to pick that evidence? Take a second, revise your answer if you need to. Or I guess I would say, like, not even just revise your answer, like, be ready to explain why your answer is the best based on you not
how explicit it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the follow-up prompt would be,
so, like, what evidence did you choose and how do you know that that is right, based on how little schema you had to use.
That's great. Another idea could be to potentially, if you were to share out, have another kid evaluate the amount of schema. So once you explain your answer to the class, or one student does, multiple students, maybe 1 to 2, then evaluate the amount of schema you used, or that student used, in order to defend his or her answer, which goes back to argument and best evidence.
When the student gives their answer, multiple students evaluate whether the evidence they gave is strong or weak based on how much schema they're required.
Great. Perfect. Before we move on to the next question, do you want to quickly summarize the content implications and the instructional?
Sure.
Or sorry, the content next steps and instructional reflection.
So I think with the content next steps, really emphasizing and being clear on that key point around, like, is the evidence explicit? Is it the evidence that needs the least amount of schema where we don't have to make an inference? And asking that question over and over again. And to do that instructionally, to make that key point come alive, having a student give their answer and then having multiple students evaluate to what extent that answer is strong or weak based on how much schema is required and how much of an inference they had to make, and leading discussion around that.
Great. Perfect. All right, so let's move on to section 2. Let's just move on, watch out the video. So that's fun. Great. Okay, so we just looked at which students were B and BB. I want us to focus because we have such a large chunk of students at B, right, basic, and did not make the hump to proficient. I want us to look at which questions did they struggle on the most?
Yeah.
Especially the group of students that we identified.
Yeah. It was interesting, like, because that was different. Like, number 1, like, had low overall, but when you look actually at the B specifically, question 2 was the lowest.
And talk to me about question 2.
So the thing that stands out to me immediately about question 2 is that it asks kids to pick 2 choices. And when you look at the data, and I know, like, the content here is important too, but when you look at the data, only, like, 21% of kids of the B kids actually picked 2 answers. So even though some of them picked 1 answer that was right, very few of them went so far as to pick the 2 answers.
Okay, so let's write that down for format and type, because I think that's really a huge format thing in terms of potentially what they are, the understanding of the question. And then content-wise, what about that question could have made it hard for them to pick two answers? Because a question is a character motivation question.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's almost two skills. I feel like, which is hard.
Okay.
Which also probably tripped them up, because it's definitely character motivation. There may be some kids who also don't know what similar means, and so there's like a bit of context clue used as well.
Yeah, can I actually ask you a question? What even just the format of the question? What does it? It looks more like the questions we find on our language boards. Given it has like an underlined word in a box.
Yes. Yep. Totally. And I think that definitely contributed to the distractor, because if kids are like, oh, similar is underlined, I'm looking for like a sentence here that like refers to something being similar. And actually, like, so answer option C says Coyote made a sound, which was the biggest distractor. Coyote made a sound like a bear growling to tease the bees, and that is the
showing that two things is similar.
Yeah, and it's the only distractor. So D, which was the correct answer, talks about blending in, but that's not as explicit, right? Like, making a sound like a bear sounds like you're making a similar noise, and this doesn't actually say, like, you have to read this carefully to understand similar to what, and it's not a bear, it's to the bees.
Right.
Because he hears a growing hum the bees are making, makes a similar noise to that. And on top of that, it's a character motivation question. So what's his motivation for making a noise? Why would he be he's not trying to tease the bees, he's trying to get the honey.
Right.
So, like, blending in aligns with his motivation. Calming the bees aligns with his motivation, because he's trying to achieve his motivation.
So let's break down the content of this question. So, because you pulled out a lot of great things. So it was around understanding what the question was, basically understanding it was a character motivation question.
Yeah, and like understanding that it's
maybe the one I just also pointed out might be a format question too. The way just like the underlined word, the small the aspects that they're like analyzing one sentence, comprehension out of one sentence.
Even though a word is underlined.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they have to make an inference about what the word is referring to. Like, not even just the meaning of the word, but like what it's talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. What is it referring to exactly?
Not the meaning of a word, and like infer the context almost that a word is referring to.
Yeah.
And then they need to also understand, so it's a character motivation question, but the correct answer choices don't necessarily state the ultimate motivation, right? There are other smaller motivations that are tied to that, like calming the bees helps me achieve my motivation of getting the honey.
Yep.
So like understand how smaller character motivations connect to a larger motivation.
So when you think about instructional actions that might have led, or we might have missed related to this?
I think I over-scaffolded, so for the format piece, I think I over-scaffolded when it came to questions with two answers. Those were in the lesson plans, but I was always like, remember to pick two, and me saying that meant that they didn't independently build that skill for themselves.
Or read the question. Yeah. So what do you want to do differently? Other than not prompting, maybe having them
like annotate, underline when they see that.
So not prompting.
Yeah, not prompting for question format, but teaching them how to annotate for it. And then I'd say like praising when they do, or reinforcing.